10:15 because we do have a lot to cover. And so here we go. Welcome. It's great to see so many of you here, and it's great to be here at DrupalCon Global 2020. We are here for JavaScript is Coming to Eat You, wherein we are going to talk about Drupal and JavaScript and how we build the web and how things have been changing over the past few years. I just see Mike Potter said this is the best session title, which thank you. Some of my colleagues and business partners don't like it, but I've always been quite fond of it also. So my name is Tim Broker, otherwise known as Citizen Tim, and I am a co-founder and technical director at Electric Citizen, which is a small but mighty Drupal agency in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is where we should all be right now for my 10th consecutive DrupalCon. So very disappointed that we couldn't all be in person and that I couldn't celebrate my 10th DrupalCon anniversary in my home city, but I'm honored to have the chance to talk to you here, and very happy to see you all. So I started my career in the web in 1994, which was pretty much the beginning of the web. I think when I built my first production website that someone paid me money for, there were less than 10,000 sites on the entire internet. It was early 1994. I have a spreadsheet somewhere. I've built enterprise-grade CMS solutions in over 16 different content management systems over those years. But for the last 13 years, I have been a very happy and satisfied Drupal developer with a Drupal agency and love Drupal. And frankly, it has sort of been the focus of my career for a large portion of it, and probably a lot of you also. To answer Benji, my 10th consecutive North American DrupalCon. I have yet to make a European DrupalCon. And then I put this bullet point in because this is sort of the jumping off point for this entire talk. I attended BADCamp in 2018. I was speaking on Drupal, but while I was there, there were numerous sessions on a new framework that was just released called Gatsby, which you may have heard of. We'll talk about it more later. And Kyle Matthews, the founder, was there and gave a great session. There was another Gatsby session. And I was also first introduced to the term Jamstack, which we will be talking about quite a bit later. And I came back from that conference, and for the next 2+ years up until today, I have pretty much immersed myself into this world of JavaScript and how it is changing what and how we build the web. And so this session is sort of a journey through these past 2 years, and hopefully insightful, and at the end some hopefully good advice on how you can get started in this world. So I want to start by just giving a quick brief overview of how we build the web historically. And I've broken it up into 3 little segments here, 10-year segments. So again, I started my career in the web in 1994, and I sort of refer to this period as the Renaissance, where there was just this literal explosion of people building HTML files, and then CSS came out, and then we very quickly learned how to talk to a server with a CGI script. Very shortly after that, we started getting server-side languages like ASP Classic and PHP that allowed us to talk to databases. And right about in the middle of this period, people started building their own custom CMSs. Of those 16 that I talked about, I think I, in my career, have built 3 or 4 of my own CMSs way back in the day. It was also the rise of the early commercial CMSs. If you were back there, back in those days, there was Vignette and Broadvision, and they all came with $250,000 license fees. And it was also the early days of the open source CMS. Both, I think Drupal 1 was 2001 and WordPress a little bit after that. And there was all sorts of early rumblings in the CMS. But by the end of this 10-year period, most sites are still not using a CMS. It barely registered on the metrics, some of which we'll look at later. Oops. I jumped slides there. There we go. So then in 2004, roughly, we entered a new period, sort of the rise of the CMS. And this is when both Drupal and WordPress first really started to become popular, and the LAMP stack was exploding. And in 2004, we got introduced to Ajax through Google Gmail. and sort of new ways of doing this. And it was sort of the origins of the cloud and software as a service, and all of these commercial CMSs started sort of coalescing around this idea of how we build the web. Sort of the golden age of, taking all that stuff we had learned in the past 10 years and finding sort of common ways for us to move forward as we build the web. I seem to have a weird delay here when I press my space bar, but nonetheless, so then we get to 2014, and I break this out into a very distinct period for 3 reasons: React, Angular, and Vue. These are all front-end JavaScript libraries. They were all released or open sourced roughly within a 6-month period, right around 2014. And if you, like me, have been going to a lot of DrupalCons, 2014 is the year you really started seeing add that Drupal camps. Session after session after session on headless, decoupled Drupal and this new approach. And there was a couple-year period where it seemed like most of the sessions were talking about these 3 frameworks. I had an earlier version of the slide with many, many more bullet points and all the other things that were happening with Node.js and the early rise of serverless functions and stuff. But really, I think in the popular bind, it can be best defined by these 3 front-end frameworks. React, of course, was released by Facebook, Angular by Google, and Vue by an independent developer named Evan You. And they all sort of were, they all sort of came about at the same time, I think, in response to that 10-year history of when Ajax first came out and people were discovering that we needed better ways to build the web and new approaches to how we treat the front end. So despite that, though, I would say most of us here, of which there are now 373 of us, are still living in 2014. And I'm very much included in that. My agency is still a Drupal agency. I am still a Drupal developer. And the fact is, the way we build websites has, we've gotten better at things, but it's remained virtually unchanged for the past 15 years. We have a database, we have a web server, we render a bunch of stuff, and we push it out to the browser, and the user gets it. So whether you're an agency or a developer or a project funder or a client, this is sort of the world that I live in, and I think a lot of you probably are still living in. And frankly, it's a pretty great place to be. As you know, we enjoy a multi-billion-dollar global marketplace between, that's the entire sort of traditional CMS market. And frankly, Drupal or WordPress or a similar solution is still the default and obvious choice for many clients and many developers. And, this long 10, 15-year history has sort of coalesced into sort of this way to do it, and that's sort of the obvious choice that most people expect. And then lastly, of course, innovation continues at great speed. Like, it may have fundamentally been unchanged for the past 15 years, but the fact is we get better and better and better and better with every life cycle. With WordPress, we see things like Gutenberg and a much improved admin UI. And with Drupal, of course, we have Drupal 8 and now Drupal 9 and all of the great things that have come along with that. So it is a great place to be, and that's evidenced by just looking at some of the popular Drupal and WordPress sites that are out there. It's fair to say that Drupal, WordPress, and similar solutions are running many of the world's largest corporation websites, many of the largest governmental websites, many of the largest educational institutions, nonprofits, you name it. We've sort of conquered this world and know what we're doing by this point. As evidenced by the CMS Market Share. So this is 2020. By I think at the end of 2014, it was roughly 35% of all sites were running some form of CMS. And just in the past 6 years, that's almost doubled to now where we have 61% of sites running some form of traditional CMS. This could be Drupal, WordPress, Squarespace, Shopify, Wix, Joomla, Expression Engine, Sitecore, you name it, some sort of traditional CMS, and about 40% of the web is running on something else, unidentifiable, whether it's a plain HTML page or what have you. So despite all that, I think if you're paying attention at all and are on the web and listen to podcasts or follow bloggers or just the general zeitgeist of the web, it's pretty obvious that some things are changing and changing quickly. And so the next few slides, I'm just going to go over a few pieces of evidence that show that. The next few slides are Google Trends. If you haven't seen it, it's a great tool that allows you to simply measure interest over time in a particular topic. And so I've chosen a time frame up here of 2004 to present, which maps up nicely with my little time segments of how we build the web. And you can see that right in about 2014, React and Angular started taking off and took off like a rocket. And React in particular continues to grow and has not come close yet to reaching its heights. Angular, of course, had a little bit of trouble with moving from Angular to Angular 2. And I think a lot of the interest dropped off and a lot of things have changed in this ecosystem that have made Angular a little less relevant than it used to be. And we'll talk about that later. A few other quick slides. Headless CMS, again, it's first started bubbling up right in 2014. By 2016, this idea of a headless or a decoupled CMS was really taking over. And again, if you were at any Drupal camps or DrupalCons, you probably heard multiple sessions talking about headless CMSs and why they matter. Node.js and NPM. Node came out a few years prior to 2014, but it really started to take off along with some of these other technologies right around 2014 at the same time. Serverless technology, which I'll talk about again. This one really took off again around 2016. For those who don't know, serverless is this idea of there is still a server, of course, that's the caveat, but it's basically a function as a service where you can just put a function on AWS Lambda and it will sit there and you can call and run that function anytime you want. And it's a key part of the modern web, as we'll see in a bit. Couple more. Jamstack, again, we'll talk about that later. But again, right around 2014, all of these technologies just really started taking off. In addition to this notion of a full stack developer, when someone says that word, you can almost guarantee that they're talking about a JavaScript developer, not a Drupal developer or WordPress developer. And that is evidenced by the Bootcamp Market Share in 2020. There's a site called Course Report that keeps track of all of the boot camps in the world and what they're teaching, and a full 44% of them are teaching full stack JavaScript, and 5% are teaching PHP, which of course is the language of Drupal. Okay, I see a little comment. Someone said the slides weren't changing, but I'm getting confirmation that they are for others. For me, by the way, they are really slow. I'm getting a lag, so but I'm doing my best. And now we get to Drupal. This is Drupal's interest over time, over that same time period, 2014 to present. And you can see that sadly, we peaked right around 2011, 12, and have slowly sort of been going downhill ever since. WordPress has a slightly similar growth curve, although they, of course, continue to grow. And then this is the infamous Stack Overflow developer survey. This one hurts a little bit if you're familiar with it. Stack Overflow surveys, this year it was over 65,000 developers about the technologies they're using, the ones they love, the ones they prefer, and Drupal in 2020 was the #2 most dreaded web framework, sadly. I think in 2019 it was #1. So I have two thoughts about this. One is that Dries posted a great response to this, I think, on his blog, that the more you actually start to use Drupal, that this starts to flip, and the deeper you go, the less dreaded it becomes and the more wanted or loved it becomes. And I think that is very, very, very true. And I think the second most important thing about this particular slide is that WordPress is not even in this survey. It's not considered by Stack Overflow to even be a web framework. It's a CMS, whereas Drupal is being treated truly as a web framework. So I think that is great also. And now I'm going to leave the stats behind and go into some just anecdotal evidence. So this is a quote. So in our agency, of course, like many, we're often responding to RFPs. And for many years, especially over that high period of Drupal's great interest level, we would frequently get RFPs and requests saying, hey, we want a Drupal site. And we're a Drupal agency. And it was this great period in time where just by the nature of being a Drupal agency, you could win work, and people were coming to us for a Drupal site. And this came last year. We often send out questions to the client saying like, hey, are you interested in Drupal? And the response we got back was, we would prefer JavaScript-based applications. We would steer clear of Drupal. Of course, as a Drupal agency, starting to see stuff like that gets to be a little worrisome, but it's real. It's no longer do we get calls or emails simply because we are Drupal developers. Some other anecdotal evidence. I want to look at two sort of classic Drupal sites that for forever, I think the Weather Channel first launched, I forget what year, but both The Economist and the Weather Channel have historically been held up as shining examples of what Drupal can do. The Weather Channel in particular, I believe, is still one of the highest traffic websites on the internet. And The Economist, of course, is an internationally famous publication. And for years, again, you can still go to the Drupal case study site. These sites are still up there. But what I learned in prep for this session is that both of them in 2020 have moved away from Drupal. The Economist is now on a Go platform with a distributed REST API, and the Weather Channel has moved to a Node.js backend with a React front end. And I found this actually in a conference talk submission by a weather.com employee. And in his submission, they talked about why they moved away from Drupal: poor performance, sluggish load times and unreliable availability, instability. They were using Drupal with Angular, but they did it all in a sort of monolithic application where it was all being pushed together, and they had trouble with that. And slower developer velocity. The majority of our developers had front-end experience, but very, very few of them were knowledgeable about the inner workings of Drupal and PHP. So what this all sort of adds up to, I think, is this battle or dichotomy between what we've been doing for the past 15 years, which I'm going to refer to as the monolithic CMS. And again, that can be Drupal or WordPress or Expression Engine or Squarespace or any sort of traditional CMS. And what I'm going to refer to, mainly for convenience, as the modern web. In the next few slides, I'm going to do my best job to sort of explain the difference between those two. So again, the monolithic CMS, this is what we've been doing for the past 15 years, and it hasn't changed much. At the center, you have a content management system, whether it's Drupal or WordPress or any other system, and everything runs through that system. If you are going to do an integration, it's going to run through your CMS. If you're going to plug in commerce, you're probably going to pick Drupal Commerce or WooCommerce for WordPress. To search, you're going to be looking at the Drupal Search API, and so on, all the way around the board. If you're going to write custom code, you're going to write a Drupal module. Everything runs through the CMS, of course, tied to a database and a web server. And if you're lucky, you're behind a great cache layer. And ultimately, this big monolithic CMS talks to the server, generates a bunch of HTML, and pushes it to the user, right? That's what we've been doing for just about forever. And there are some great advantages to that, of course. It's proven and time tested. As I said, we've been doing this for 15 years, and we just get better and better and better at it. And the infrastructure gets better. The hosting platforms like Pantheon and Acquia get better. It's extremely flexible, as evidenced by that earlier slide, with all of these huge corporations and government entities and schools. There's very little you can't do in this framework. And we've solved most of the hard stuff. We know how to do entity references, and we now know how to handle media, and we know how to do caching, and all of these sort of difficult problems in the content management world have been solved. And again, we have lots of ongoing innovations, not like we've stopped, whether you're Drupal or WordPress or any other CMS. These continue to grow and evolve. But by the same token, there are a few sort of issues, historical issues that aren't going away, and I think are very real. The first is that these sites can be very expensive to build. Anyone who runs a Drupal agency or has gotten a bid for a complex, ambitious Drupal or WordPress website knows that it's not a inexpensive proposition. These monolithic CMSs can be very expensive to host and scale. You're typically relying on the infrastructure of a giant company like Pantheon or Acquia, and load balancing and cache layers and a global CDN, et cetera, and that gets very expensive. We're talking anywhere from $400 to many thousands of dollars a month just to, get your feet on the ground. The days of sort of shared hosting, I think, are long over. Platform lock-in, despite how flexible any of these CMSs are, once you lock into Drupal or WordPress, you're there, and it's going to be an effort to get out of that if you want to. Thankfully, most of us don't want to, but the fact is, you buy into this platform, and once you're in there without expending quite a bit of effort to get out. Front-end lock-in, again, Drupal, we use Twig. I don't know that WordPress even has an official theme engine, but you're locked into this idea of a PHP templated theme, and it is what it is, and you do your best and to provide a good experience within that framework or within that paradigm. These sites are also quite expensive in our experience to support over time. It's not like you launch a Drupal site and walk away from it. You are constantly churning through security updates and module updates and minor version updates and major version updates, and kind of never ends. It's a very expensive system to buy into, both on multiple levels. And of course, you can argue that many people have solved this and that Drupal sites aren't so bad, but it's also fairly easy to argue that a lot of these are quite slow and bulky. And if you look at lighthouse scores of a typical Drupal or WordPress site, they don't always do so great. Another problem with the monolithic CMS, and I am as guilty of this as anybody, this is Maslow's maxim. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's very, very easy when you've been developing Drupal for 15 years like I have to see it as the solution for just about everything, because it really can be. But by the same token, that's not always the greatest thing in the world when there may be other solutions out there that are better. So I am now going to contrast that with what I am referring to as the modern web, or another way to think about it is the distributed web, or a great phrase from the old Unix days, small pieces loosely joined. It is a very, very different paradigm than this idea of running everything, your theme, your commerce, your search, your everything through a single stack. It looks a little bit more like this. So again, the small pieces loosely joined. Instead of running through one central stack in the center, you have all these little pieces on the side that are coming together to combine into a singular experience, but they're all coming from different places. So you probably still have a Headless CMS, but it doesn't have to be Drupal or WordPress. It can be one. We're going to talk more about some Headless CMSs in a bit. You're probably going to be connecting to one or more external APIs to get some data from. You may be relying on real-time data from MongoDB or some other service. You're likely to be writing some serverless functions like I talked about before to do things in the backend for your site. And you are highly likely to be relying on some managed services, software as a service, or I have more examples of that later. But the idea is, again, rather than this one monolithic stack that you're building on, you're sort of picking and choosing a bunch of little pieces to put together into a modern website or web app. Increasingly, that means that you're hosting your website directly off of a global CDN. This is especially true in the Jamstack world, which again, I'll talk about more. But where you are no longer churning out server rendering pages on an expensive database and pushing them out to the user, you're often now able to literally host your whole application directly on the edge, which is amazing. And you also likely may be interacting with a Node.js server to do various backend tasks. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're pushing all of that out with your front-end library. You bring your own front-end, and you bring your own distributed backend, and ultimately your job then is to build a nice user experience using whichever tools seem best to you at that point in time. And of course, all of these tools, again, I'm getting some slide lag here, but all of these tools are based in JavaScript. This session is not called Go is coming to eat you or Rust is coming to eat you, although those are both becoming quite popular languages. The fact is that in 2020, JavaScript is the language of the web. For those of us living in 2014, it's time to, I think, come to terms with that a little bit. Another key factor about the modern web is that all of these little pieces have been commoditized and or free. You can now get pick from dozens of off-the-shelf headless CMSs. There are free tiers of authentication services like Auth0. You can outsource your search to Elasticsearch or Algolia. You can sign up for free or paid APIs to pull in data. All of these front-end libraries are free. Through Netlify, which is a great hosting platform I'll talk about a bit later, you can run up to, I think, 250,000 free serverless function calls without paying a dime. Similar to how we've solved a lot of problems in the monolithic CMS world, all of these problems in the modern web have been sort of solved and commoditized, which is a key component of it. Because what that means then is that rather than focusing all of our energy on building the best possible Drupal site within the constraints of what Drupal might be, we are now focusing our energy on picking the best tools for each little job that we might have to do, building the front end exactly the way we want, whether it's a interactive web app or a fast, speedy React website, whatever it might be, and really focusing on the user experience versus like, hey, we're not building a Drupal site anymore. We're building user experiences by sort of combining all of these tools together. So another way to look at it is that in the monolithic CMS, our goal is to build the best possible user experience within the constraints of my CMS. And we do a pretty good job of that. On the modern web, our job is to build the best possible experience by combining the best tools and components. It's a very different model. So it is easy, though, especially if, like me, you've been a Drupal developer for any length of time, to still remain pretty skeptical of this world. Questions you might ask yourself: Can't Drupal also provide a great user experience? Won't I lose a lot of out-of-the-box features from Drupal if I start exploring this pathway? And isn't this just another expensive set of problems to solve? And of course, the answer to all three of those questions is an unqualified yes. You can, of course, build a great user experience in Drupal, and if you leave Drupal behind, you are going to leave behind a lot of great things about Drupal that are sort of built into this monolithic platform that allows it to do what it does. But I think the question we should all be asking ourselves is, what if, despite all that, there is a better way to build the web? And so the next few slides, I'm going to look at that and sort of from an objective and hopefully pragmatic perspective, look at some of the, I've got 5 key criteria here for what makes a good website. We could obviously add a bunch more, but I think these are 5 pretty key criteria for what are we, what are we building and what makes it good. Speed, of course, is increasingly important as the world goes more and more mobile. Flexibility, the ability to do what you want with your CMS and change it over time. The user experience, what the end user is actually getting at the end of the day. The developer experience, what we as developers and designers and agencies are experiencing as we're building these sites. And lastly, the overall cost. So I'm just going to quickly zoom through all 5 of these. And again, I've been sort of heavily immersed in this world since 2018 now, and these are all sort of just my personal experiences and feedback on these criteria. So speed and performance. In this modern web world with a modern JavaScript framework, you have things like preloading and tree shaking and critical rendering, and with the Jamstack, static builds and cloud-native serverless functions. And it is really hard to argue that a traditional server-side rendered app is going to be faster than that. You can certainly build any JavaScript app that is slower than any WordPress or Drupal site you've ever met, but in the right hands, you can do things and achieve lighthouse performance scores that are very, very, very difficult to do in Drupal or most other traditional CMSs. Flexibility. So I think this one is huge. Again, we're data agnostic, right? You might choose Drupal as your headless CMS, but you're probably also talking to APIs and maybe a dedicated MongoDB database, or an Airtable for that matter. You really choose where your data is coming from, and it doesn't always have to go into Drupal or your CMS. Front-end agnostic, again, I think this is critical. We're not just building websites, we're building mobile apps, mobile-friendly web apps, Internet of Things, display experiences, all sorts of things. And this idea that you can build your own front end and choose whichever one you love the best and put it on is great. And again, this idea of choosing from one of many tools to assemble the right tool for the right job is very powerful. And while Drupal, of course, is extremely flexible, I think it is arguable that the modern web is even more flexible. User experience. Now, this one can be kind of hard to quantify, but again, I think it's generally, when you're interacting with a well-built JavaScript application, it's generally faster. It's more delightful. It's the difference between, say, an app like Netflix or Instagram or any of the other JavaScript-driven websites or apps you use. They just tend to feel better and have nicer interactions. And frankly, they can often be more functional, especially when you're talking about things that are more applications, like you've got a multi-page form or an interactive wizard that you want to drive people through. It's much easier to become more functional in this modern web approach. Developer experience. Now, I have a lot to say about this one because, again, I've been developing in Drupal for forever and for two some years now in the modern web. And again, I give the edge to the modern web here. If you haven't experienced it, this idea of component-driven development, and I use that term loosely. There are React components, of course. But again, this idea of picking components from the top all the way down to your front end is very, very powerful and fun to work with. Single stack development, I think this one is also big, maybe not so much for a dedicated Drupal developer, but the fact is, looking at those bootcamp stats and everything else that is happening in the world, it's very powerful to have a single stack for your entire application, front end, back end, and middleware. And this one is subjective, of course, but I truly find it more delightful to build in this environment. It harkens back to that Renaissance period where we were literally building everything by hand. And if you wanted something that looked cool or did something, you weren't pulling a module off the shelf. You were sort of constructing it and building it. And it's been great. It's great. It has reintroduced a lot of joy to the development process for me. And lastly, overall cost. I think the jury is still out on this one. Our agency has not yet launched enough modern websites to have a full picture of this, but from what I've seen and from what I hear others say, I truly believe that these three things are true, that we have lower overall development costs, in that you are able to pick a lot of these commoditized tools and services and wire them together in a way that I think can be much more efficient than trying to build the ocean out of a monolithic CMS. Lower hosting costs, especially in the Jamstack world. If you are hosting on the edge, you don't have a server to run. You don't have to pay Pantheon $400 a month or more to run that server. Instead, you might be paying Pantheon $50 a month for their base level plan just to have your Drupal site, and everything else gets pushed out onto a global CDN, and the cost of doing that, frankly, is almost zero until you get a little bit popular, and then we start talking about things like, hey, $25 a month. It's very, very efficient and fast. And lastly, this one, I think this is true, but I'm not positive yet because we haven't been in this world long enough, but I do believe that the overall support costs are lower in that in a lot of cases, someone else is supporting your authentication or your search, and all you're worried about is that it works. So that all leads me to this conclusion, and that is that I believe in the next 10 years, we are going to see a very sharp reversal in the CMS market share slide that I showed you earlier. Again, right now, 61% of websites are running some identifiable CMS. I believe over the next 10 years, that is going to absolutely flip on its head, and that 80% of the websites simply won't have an identifiable CMS. This, by the way, that earlier slide came from what CMS is this? You're able to sort of see who's running what. So that's sort of where I see the world going based on my sort of 2 years in this world. And it begs the question then, why am I still here? Why are we still here? Why are we at DrupalCon? If all this stuff is really so great and so fast and more cost effective, why are we here? So the sort of one of the key central tenets of this modern web is that you still need a CMS. it's a integral. In fact, it might probably will be the most important part of your modern web, in that you still need editors who can log in and add content. You still need a place to store your content and structure and model your content. It's a key component of this. And as a result of that, this huge giant market has sprung up around the headless CMS. If you go to a website called headlesscms.org, you'll see these and dozens more. There's open source versions and private versions, and companies like Contentful, which just took in another huge investment and are now valued at $1 billion. Sanity.io just took a $3.5 million investment. Because the headless CMS is so central to this modern web, this market just in the past 3 or 4 years has absolutely exploded around this idea of, hey, these people need a CMS to manage their content. See, do I still have my mic? My phone sadly started ringing. Okay, good. Hopefully you can't hear my phone. If you can, it'll end here in a second. I thought I turned my ringer off. Here's my phone right here. Okay. So, again, giant headless CMS market. So again, if that's true and all of these have been commoditized, why is Drupal still relevant? And I am here to tell you why, and why I am still a huge believer in Drupal. And it all starts back in 2016, DrupalCon New Orleans, well before Drupal 8 arrived, and during the state of Drupal, the Dries Note, which he gave a great talk earlier today that talked even more about this initiative and some of the JavaScript things coming up in Drupal. But this was an actual slide from that presentation. API first initiative. Integrate with other systems, bring your content anywhere, display it as you wish. That's exactly what we're talking about here. In great testament to the Drupal community and the dozens and dozens of developers who worked on that, what that led to just last year is JSON API landing in core. And this quote was from a Dries blog post that said, the most feature complete and easiest to use JSON API implementation in existence. We also, by the way, at Drupal 8's launch, had a full REST API, and we now have GraphQL support. So why does this matter? If you have a Drupal 8 site and you haven't done this yet, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a no configuration module. You turn on the JSON API module in a Drupal 8 site, and you're done. You profit. You now have a feature complete backend that is capable of powering any modern front end. And I'm going to show you just real briefly like how that looks in the real world. So you enable this module and you go to the /JSON API, and the first thing you're going to see is an output of your site's content. Okay. If you don't know what to do with that, you can start sending queries to that JSON API. So the slide that I have up on my screen right now, this is a real life JSON API and a real life query from a React app that we just built. And it's calling my JSON API to retrieve a bunch of data about a quiz. Questions, answers, correct explanations. There's a video component to each quiz. And what that means is that on my front end, just with that simple query that I had on the left, I now have a Drupal API that is talking to a React app that is building this very modern React-based quiz. If you're a fan of the New York Times, they have a great weekly news quiz. They use Svelte, by the way, not React, but the idea is the same. It's this really sort of fun, interactive quiz that would be very, very difficult to pull off in Twig or in jQuery for that matter, or any sort of traditional template language. Here's another example. We use that same exact JSON API. This, unlike the last quiz example, this is a full-blown Gatsby site running a React front end that is pulling all of its data, its menus, everything from Drupal, and it gets built and it's hosted for free on Netlify. It uses Algolia for search and some really cool React libraries for this find help tool leads people through a series of questions. And again, some stuff that would be very difficult to do in the modern, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to spin along. I get to talking sometimes. So I wanted to throw this slide up. This is back to that weather.com and The Economist. If you continue reading down that conference proposal, you will learn that they kept Drupal as a CMS, as another testament to why Drupal is still relevant in this world. They're on a Node.js backend, and they're talking to other data servers, and they're on a React front end. But if you go to the weather.com and read an article, that data is coming from Drupal. So beyond the JSON API, again, Drupal has solved most of the hard stuff years ago. All of these headless CMSs that I showed have not. Multilingual, most of them don't have it. Entity references, most of them do, but it's pretty sketchy. All of these sort of things that we've worked as a community to solve over the past few years are still solved, and we still get that great JSON or REST API. It's 100% free and open source. Most of those examples that I showed earlier are not, and they all have free tiers, but they get expensive very, very quickly. You can get up to over $1,000 a month for Contentful without even thinking about it. And that's largely because they're limited by records. Hey, you can store up to 20,000 records for this price, or rate limits like, okay, you can get this many requests. Those problems don't exist with Drupal. We've solved all the problems. We have this great JSON API, and there's no record or rate limits. We can do what we want with it. And Drupal, of course, is still as flexible as it ever has been. And it works very, very nicely in this world. So what can Drupal do better? I've got 4 minutes left, so I think we'll be okay. So this is all highly opinionated from me. I think, and if you didn't see Dries' keynote, he talked a lot about this today and where Drupal is moving, but I think we need a more modern admin UI and UX. A lot of these headless CMSs do have these gorgeous, beautiful React-based or JavaScript-based front ends that simply make Drupal look and feel slow. Most of these headless CMSs, and again, this is sort of that idea of connecting pieces, have hosted services. So in today's world, you largely still need to have someone responsible for setting up Drupal and managing it and hosting it for you. I think it would be great if more people started offering hosted Drupal as a service, similar to like going and clicking a button on Contentful and suddenly having a Drupal site to connect to your front end. This one may be controversial for any long-term Drupalites, but the fact is there's a lot in this model that doesn't get used in Drupal. And I think it would be great if we could at least explore this idea of releasing an API first version of Drupal that doesn't have all the stuff we don't need. I think that might help some developer uptake. If you've used WordPress lately, you may have used Gutenberg, or if you've ever used the Go CMS, they both now have these, what I really came around on this, it took me a long time, but these gorgeous, beautiful editor interfaces, especially for building things like landing pages that are much more modern and easy to use than trying to do the same thing in, say, the Drupal paragraphs module. So there is a Drupal Gutenberg module. I've used it. It's really coming along great. It still isn't quite up to where WordPress Gutenberg is. And frankly, I think WordPress Gutenberg still needs some work, but this is where I see the admin UI going and where I think Drupal could really compete. And lastly, I think Drupal needs to find a way to get back into the conversation. If you are on Twitter or listen to podcasts or watch sort of what's happening in the modern world with the modern web, frankly, Drupal is very rarely mentioned. Most people don't even know what it is these days in that world. And of course, we all know that Drupal is this very spectacular system. So, okay, I'm not going to be able to finish probably all these slides, but this last few minutes here is my highly opinionated guide to the modern web. If I don't finish, I'm not sure if I get immediately cut off. If I do, all these slides will be in my deck. But if you're interested in this, here's where I would go. So first of all, if it was 2014, I would have to explain a lot of very complicated things to you, and you would have to go through an extremely large learning curve just to even get started. In 2020, things that used to be hard are now extremely easy, and the cost of entry into this world is exactly zero. It's all based on free tiers and one-click demos and automation and managed services, and you can jump into this world instantly for no cost and very little effort just to get started. This one may be controversial, but if you are coming into this greenfield, I would choose React, mainly because it's still the most popular front-end framework. It's built into WordPress. Dries talked today about providing support for both React and Vue. That said, if you're want to get into this, React I think is the way to go. If you are going to use React, this is a quote from a podcast in 2019 that I listened to called Syntax FM. I would never build anything in React without choosing Next or Gatsby. These are two React-based frameworks that both do very similar things. Next, however, allows you to do server-side rendering and static rendering. And I think here in July of 2020, this still holds true. If you move into this world, I would choose one of these two frameworks. And now, okay, I wanted to make sure I got to these next two slides. I would encourage everyone here now to forget everything I just said, forget about Drupal, forget about React, and simply go to sanity.io/create. And from there, if you have a GitHub account, you'll have to create a Netlify account to take the final step of hosting this, and a Sanity account. Within about 5 minutes, you can have a fully modern CMS. This is sanity.io. It's a React-based CMS hosted on a global CDN that could literally tomorrow handle millions of views without you doing anything except for paying a little bit of extra money. Running on a modern front-end framework. The first one you can see in my screenshot is a blog with Gatsby, but I think they have about 6 examples, and you could just do this, and you'll have your Git repository and this extremely modern site just to play with. Okay, I'm just at time here, so I'm going to quickly finish up. After you do that, I would highly recommend spinning up your own Gatsby site with a Drupal backend. If you do that, it'll take you about 1 weekend probably to learn, and you'll, at the end of that, have a basic understanding of React. That's how I started learning React, was Drupal and Gatsby. A basic understanding of GraphQL, which is a new modern way of querying data and getting it into your front end. You'll learn how a Headless CMS works in this environment. If you push it up to Netlify, you'll know how to host a fast, scalable, and secure modern application hosted right on the edge. And if you explore a little bit, you'll learn how to start pulling in data other than Drupal. So with that said, I'm at time, so I think I'm going to wrap up real quickly. Again, these will be on my deck. Embrace the Jamstack. It truly is sort of where I think that 80%, 20% is moving things more and more to the Jamstack. There's a huge ecosystem to explore. There's tech Twitter. If you follow any 3 of these people, you will immediately be sort of immersed in this world. I'd encourage you to follow all of them. Jesus, who I know is in the session, I listed him. He's been doing great work in the Gatsby Drupal world. Podcasts, there's a great number of front-end podcasts that I listen to religiously. And learning the fundamentals of JavaScript. You know, this is JavaScript still. It's not like that you get a free pass. You still need to learn this stuff. And for me, someone who first learned JavaScript back in 2004, things have changed a lot, and it's important to learn it. So, all right, there are just a couple slides left. Again, they're going to be on my deck, but I very much appreciate everyone turning out. Wow, 438 people. I'll be around. I don't know how we do Q&As after this, but I think there's a networking tab, and I love to talk about this stuff, and I'm happy to do so with all of you. So again, thank you.